Okay, this does sound like it's on. Hi. I'm just going to jump right in because I'm conscious of the fact that lunch is an hour away, and this is always a bad spot because I'm sure everybody's hungry, including me. So we'll just jump in. The presentation is in two parts. So part one is a little bit of where we're at right now and kind of how we got here, and then part two is where we potentially need to go in the future. And the future may actually be much closer than we'd like. So yeah, massive change. I mean, things are moving so incredibly fast. I've been working in the mobile space for, I don't know, 6, 7 years, something like that. I kind of forget a lot of times, but things are moving faster and faster. It used to be that you could spend a year kind of understanding 1 or 2 devices that you'd need to support, maybe 6 or 7 devices. Now things are they just amplify like crazy now, and so it's causing a lot of movement. This is a lovely quote that I think is quite indicative of where we're at right now, especially in regards to the web. So the most profound technologies are those that completely disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they're indistinguishable from it. And interestingly, this was back in 1991. Mark Weiser was discussing, ubiquitous computing before there was ubiquitous computing. But in very many ways, the internet, especially now that it's kind of attached to one of these and a lot of other things that we carry around, it has pretty much kind of disappeared. You don't think about it, it's just there. You use it whenever you need to. And when it's not there, like this morning when the Wi-Fi was briefly not working, all of a sudden there's this great big panic. Because it's just it's like running water, you just need it. So there used to be a very much kind of old-fashioned way that we interacted with us, people's places, things, and stuff. It was all very, very physical, very, very tangible. You had to physically do things. So, you wanted to learn stuff, you had to physically go to a library, find the book, locate it, sit down, find a place to sit. And, this does still happen. This is actually, from what I understand, this is actually the largest library in the world at the moment. Anyways, it's in Shenzhen, on mainland China. So, this hasn't completely gone, but on the other hand, we've got information all over the place now. And same thing with speaking to people. I mean, I love coming to these things because I can finally meet people that I've spoken to virtually for ages. But still, this used to be the only way, right? Where we used to actually physically go places and talk to people. And now we've got entire lives that are somewhere else. Certainly shopping, consumption stuff. I mean, I can't remember the last time I didn't choose to buy a book on Amazon, regrettably, even though sometimes I can find it locally. There's just so much stuff that now is done online. And so, again, it wasn't really a choice at first, right? I mean, there was physics and geography very much related to it. Here I am in Amsterdam, and we booked flights and things online. I remember 15 years ago booking a trip to Japan. I wrote little letters, and I put stamps on envelopes, and I sent them to Japan, and I waited for about 4 weeks for the letters to come back saying, yes, you have a reservation. All of that stuff is it's kind of disappeared. It's not evenly distributed. Not everyone can do everything at the same rate, but still, it's just completely changed. So the internet came along, and all of a sudden, whoosh, and it has actually really gone pretty fast when you consider how long the internet's been around. However, the internet is actually kind of changing quite a bit lately. There was still very much of an activity thing around the net. It was, you'd go into a special room, and, you would sit down in front of your computer, and, you'd have your desk and your chair and all your little anime characters at the top on the shelf there, and you'd have your space basically to sit and work, and that would be kind of being at the computer. It would mean a certain thing, usually related to work. And so there was this fairly specific context, and now that's kind of been all jumbled around. And so this is where I'm going to kind of stop for a second and go into a bit of a historical interlude of how did we get here. I mean, because we've had computers for a little while now. We've had mobile phones for a little while, even though every country is a bit different as to how they experience them and what computers and what phones and what devices were mainstream at what point in time. Still, it's not like this is all brand new. So why is it that right now this is happening rather than a few years ago? So this quote from Eric Schmidt of Google is quite indicative. I mean, one of the estimates is that there's about 35 billion devices connected to the internet, and soon there will be so many that we'll stop counting. And that's just becoming lately, it's almost a bit of a running joke because there's everything is connected, and some of Google's announcements a couple days ago at I/O of placing sensors, basically placing fragments of Android around your home and around everything that you own, all of a sudden, this number starts to sound even crazy because technically, there will be fragments of the internet everywhere in the future, and it is going to happen. So yeah, we'll just stop counting completely at some point. At the moment, there's about 6.8 billion people on the planet. That was in 2010. And about 77% of them at the moment have a mobile device, which is pretty good, really, when you consider all the different income brackets and ways that people acquire technology. I mean, we're getting close to the point, at some point pretty soon, where everyone will have some sort of mobile device. What we also have really, really recently, and again, this is something that's almost really in the last 3 or 4 years that it's just kind of all of a sudden exploded, is that we have some free platforms, and we always had a few, and at certain times there's been a few more and a few less of them, but Android certainly has made a big difference, specifically over the last kind of 24 months. And then on top of that, it's low-cost components, and you're now at a point where you can basically just kind of build a device if you want to for a fairly small amount of money and throw a platform on it, and all of a sudden you've got something that's actually a product you can sell to a consumer. And that was kind of unheard of, even 4 or 5 years ago in some ways. And that was why we had the Nokias and the Samsungs and so on, who were large companies and who had engineering expertise and manufacturing and all of this stuff. And it took a long time to get a product to market. We're talking 18, 24 months to get something out the door. And now there's devices being produced strangely over the space of 6 or 8 weeks. And so yeah, it's causing a lot of disruption. And just to give you a basic idea of how it's working at the moment, and this is, these numbers change all the time, and there's a really nice bunch of articles there. The presentation's on SlideShare. I'll give the link at the end. But if anything that I'm referencing, if there's links, they'll be on the slides. And you can get Android, basically. You go to China, you speak to some manufacturers, you can even do a lot of it online through places like Alibaba, get some components made up. And you've got your dual-core processor, your touch screen, nice QVGA touch screen, a camera, and some GPS and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, so it's kind of a good basic phone. And it's less than $90 worth of components with your case, and in about 4 weeks you've got a phone. And that's just the basic idea of how anyone can have something manufactured. And so what it means is that people are making stuff, right? So there's a manufacturer, or rather a company in the UK, for example. It's a clothing manufacturer. They're called Next, and they sell cheap clothing to teenagers. And last Christmas they made an Android tablet. It just kind of, I guess, decided they were going to do it because it was cheap. They could do it. They have a big catalog that they sell to a lot of people in the UK. You get the catalog by mail, and grandmothers will order things for their grandchildren from the catalog. And so why not sell a tablet in the catalog, right? So they ordered a tablet. They had it made, and they sold it. And from what I understand, it was horrible. It was a terrible tablet. You just couldn't use it. It was one of these things where the screen was terrible and it didn't respond. But still, some people bought it because it was there. And this is kind of the environment that we're in right now. So even though certain companies will spend proper amounts of time and have designers and engineers who really carefully architect the relationship between the software and the hardware and the products that they build, and they decide who it's for and they market it in a certain way and so on, then you also have companies who just simply want to make stuff and sell it, just the way there's a million companies making shoes or jeans or anything else. Now you kind of have whoever wants to make mobile devices can do that too. And so there's a lot more devices, and it's not really going to go away. And the other thing that it's doing is that it's kind of equalizing things in really weird ways, because we used to have also very specific categories. We'd have the smartphone, and it was the really expensive device, and you'd get certain features on it, and then you had the really cheap feature phones. But it's now getting to the point where they're kind of starting to meet in the middle. Those nice little Nokias that PPK is giving away, I mean, those things, I'm sorry, they're almost a feature phone at this point. The touch screen is actually really nice. The browser is really good. It's quite responsive. The UI's been redesigned completely to work with the touch and the typing, because it's got a touch screen on top, but then a keyboard at the bottom. So it's inches or seconds or whatever away from actually being a smartphone. And some of the Android devices, the slightly lower end ones, they might as well be a feature phone, especially the ones that are really kind of cheaper and you can get for around 50 to 70 euro. So the categories are blurring, and it also means that people who never would have had a device before all of a sudden they've got access to stuff that they wouldn't have before. And then, just to make things even more complicated, you still have more change. And I'm not going to dwell on all these links. I actually had only one at first, and I've been gradually adding more examples. I mean, these are things that all of a sudden have changed things recently, and we don't know how much they're going to change them, right? So Google recently said, okay, you can't do as much with Android as you could before because we want to standardize how people build with it, and we don't want to have as much fragmentation. So all of a sudden, there's a few people saying, okay, well, maybe we're not going to use Android anymore, maybe we should look around at something else. The point in the middle, apparently Apple is taking 60% of the global production for touchscreens at the moment. Whether that's true or not, it does show that, there's still physical things here. There's still, can you manufacture enough touchscreens so that everyone has a touchscreen? Well, how does that affect whether your product is a smartphone or a feature phone, whether you can sell it at a certain price, who has access to it? So there's still a lot of things that could disrupt what's going on right now. And then the third link at the top, Google I/O a couple days ago. Now all of a sudden, you've got bits and pieces of Android kind of more as a platform for your home and a platform for all sorts of devices. And so what we're kind of left with is, this is a quote from a bunch of IBM people got together and asked a bunch of CEOs what they're thinking about the world right now. And threats, events, opportunities are not coming at us faster or with less predictability. They're actually converging now, and they're influencing each other, and things are changing really rapidly. So, end of the historical interlude, it brings us to where we are right now, which is a whole bunch of us staring at devices in random places around the world. And we're basically in one line of connectivity. We don't have to go to the internet anymore. There isn't this step of going. A lot of us are just kind of connected to the internet all the time. It just is kind of what we do. And it's become an intricate part of our lives, from people who are really young and growing up with it all the way to people who didn't know what it was a few years ago. And it's now kind of trivial for us to be in all sorts of places at once. And I'm sure a whole bunch of you in the audience are doing something else right now. And that's become really normal. It's just, it is what we do. This is another lovely quote, but in particular of how kids growing up with this stuff right now. I mean, for kids like my 13-year-old, the boundaries between the internet and life are so porous as to be meaningless. I mean, that's just, it's priceless. But that is kind of what it is. Why can't you play with your iPad and your teddy bear? That is kind of what you do. It's become an object that's so much a part of your life. But the connectivity is part of it, because if it were just a big piece of plastic, it wouldn't be the same thing, right? If it were just inert and there was no connectivity. And so people reach for the internet using whatever device makes sense to them. And this is really a key point, because a lot of us, we still have this idea that unless you have this golden thing here, you're probably not an internet user, or maybe you're doing different things, or these are the people doing the real stuff, and then everyone else is doing something else. And that's just not true. At least it's turning out that way. I mean, the Kindle is the greatest example, because if you ever use the browser on the Kindle, I mean, it's a really weird experience. It's black and white, right? I mean, this is almost like going back to 20 years when we were watching Little Black and Old touch phone. But here, it's a quote from a gentleman on a message board talking about his daughters using it to communicate with their friends. I mean, teenagers shouldn't be using this. They should be using something kind of sexy and new and, wanting to use the latest technology. But for her, this is completely fine, even though it's painful and it's black and white and it doesn't do all the stuff that something else might do. And then, this is a quote from Jeremy Keith. Sorry, Jeremy, there's a couple of your things in here. But he was in China a couple weeks ago, and he used his Kindle to access Twitter, even though normally you can't access Twitter in mainland China. And because of the mixture of Amazon having their cloud kind of GP or 3G thing around the world, and I guess they're behind a different firewall, and this was available and he had it in his pocket, and all of a sudden he could do things that he couldn't do before. So it kind of breaks down some of the stereotypes that we have of the best device, people will do vastly different stuff, even though that is kind of true sometimes. A lot of studies lately coming out where people are studying how are people using their mobile devices, especially now that there's iPads and different devices around. And so this was a really good study from Yahoo. There's a link on the slide share if you want, of how people use phones for shopping and tablets for shopping and so on. And so 30% of people said it was just plain more convenient than their home internet. It's not that they didn't have internet at home, it was just, this was what they had and it was more convenient. Whoops. And so this is kind of changing all of our behaviors and expectations. So we had this idea in the past that things you did on a mobile phone were really quick. So you would be running around and you'd need to find an address, and then that would be your interaction, and then you put your phone down and you would do something else on the big computer. And so people still do that, right? I mean, I was at the airport, I needed my phone a few days ago, and that's what I did. It's something really quick to figure out where I was at the airport. 80% of people still use their phones for little miscellaneous downtime. When you've got a few minutes, you quickly do something. And that's still true. And a lot of people use it while waiting in line for appointments, and we all do that all the time. Here's another great example of something that couldn't have happened, just a few years ago. This is Tom Coates, a speaker who travels quite a bit, and he was recently picked up by a limo driver who looked him up while he was driving to pick him up to find out who he was, what his interests were, so that they could chat in the car. And this is all this spontaneous stuff. It's absolutely happening, and that's why the mobile is so wonderful, is all the spontaneity. But then the flip side of that is that people are actually still using it now for really specific things that are way more important in some ways than the spontaneous stuff, or at least they're different. So mobile is being combined with other activities. So people watch TV while they're using their phone, and it can be anything. It can be related to the TV, but it can also be just things that they're trying to catch up on while they're watching TV. A lot of people, 70% of people, use mobile while shopping, and it's now turning actually into something that some of the retailers are taking advantage of, because they know people are doing this. They know people are going into the store and taking pictures of a product and then going home and showing it to their spouse, or sending a text message to show it to people and saying, should I buy this or should I not? Or going on to Amazon to see if they can get it at a cheaper price. So it's changing how people shop as well. And you're getting this crazy kind of time shifting of behavior. So this is all part, again, of a big Yahoo study. 60% of people they spoke to sometimes visit a site on a mobile, but then follow up the information on their PC at home, which, again, really shows why we need to start having the same content on both sides. It's actually starting to be a real big problem for vendors and shoppers, because a lot of sites just don't match up. You'll have one experience somewhere, and then, well, it's not even experience, one content somewhere and one content somewhere else, and you can't meet them together to actually complete your transaction. And then, of course, you get the flip side. So you visit it on a PC and you follow up on a mobile. A significant number of people doing that. And then it gets even more complicated, and I won't go through all of these, but this shows actually how complicated it is. Research on a smartphone, then visit in the store, then go home and buy it on your PC. These are real behaviors from people. This is actually a Google study, a much larger one, I think, than the Yahoo one that just came out, and showing just how intricate it's become, but also how much it's actually so much part of your life that it's starting to really completely not make sense for the stuff on the mobile web, if there is a mobile web, to be vastly different from the stuff on the desktop. It doesn't add up for what people are trying to do with it. Whoops. And so people are actually doing really big things on their phones, which, again, you wouldn't have expected a few years ago. People would have said, yeah, you'd never buy a plane on your phone, right? Well, people are buying a plane on their phone, an expensive plane at that. Well, actually, as planes go, it's not that expensive. But, and people are buying a sofa. I mean, if you've ever bought a sofa, it's not something you take really lightly. It's something you go and you look at and you sit on it and you talk to people and but the actual final purchase decision was actually to do it on the phone, which is really pretty significant. So at the moment, we have about 1.3 billion people using the mobile internet. So that was out of 6.8 billion people on the planet, which is pretty good. And there's also many, many people for whom the mobile internet is their only point of access. And this slide got a lot of conversation last time I showed it, so I've added even more links at the bottom. There's a lot of studies on this lately, and it's distributed differently around the world. Sometimes it's simply because of cost. For example, in Indonesia, $100 a month approximately for home ADSL, but about $17 to access the internet, unlimited pay-as-you-go. I mean, that's such a significant difference that most people will go for the mobile internet version. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, especially in countries where the income is a lot lower. I mean, I wouldn't even pay $100 for my home internet. I think I'd probably start switching to mobile as well. It's kind of crazy. And then there's other reasons. When you look at, the United States, 25% of people in that particular survey infrequently or never use their desktop and only therefore use their mobile. I mean, that's a lot of people still. And, it brings up all sorts of questions about access and whether people even have access to desktop internet at home. But it's also a matter of convenience. So it's going to continue to be distributed in all sorts of ways, but still, there's a lot of people accessing on their phone, and it's going to continue. And it may be their only way of accessing. And this is really, one of the interesting ones as well, is by 2015, with current growth rates, web access by people on the move. So in this case, they're counting laptops, which is a bit confusing, but they're saying laptops and smart mobile devices will exceed web access from the desktop, and that by 2015, basically. So again, if you're building websites and you're thinking, oh, well, the mobile people will be these people over here who access it kind of sometimes or maybe, it's actually going to start to go the other way. How far it'll go, we're not really sure at this point. So mobile is no longer just kind of our old stereotype of a tiny little screen and one hand, and you're in a public space and you could be interrupted at any moment. It's also stuff like this now. And so all of a sudden, you have to start to think of it differently, because he's not significantly different than the guy who was on the desktop that we showed at the beginning, really. He's seated comfortably, he's got some time, he's got a work surface. And then, however, there's also small devices, right? So this guy I photographed on a train, he spent an hour sitting there with his screen like this doing something. And he actually had Wi-Fi on the train. So, is that fundamentally different from the guy with the laptop or the guy with the iPad and the keyboard? Well, his interactions are certainly going to be less smooth, and there's less he's going to be able to do, but he's got the time. So he could be doing something vastly important there that right now he might not have access to if there's no mobile internet access to it. And then you've got all the little in-betweens, right? I mean, so again, at what point do we say this is mobile and this is desktop? Does that even matter anymore? It's basically using the web in whatever way you're going to use it. And there's going to continue to be a lot of change. When you design something, this is probably an edge case, but you have to expect people will do things that you don't expect. So this creates a bit of a problem, which hopefully brings us to the other half. I'm right on track. So the problem is that we had all these guidelines, right, of when you design for the mobile device, you do this, and when you design for the desktop, you do that, and mobile users do this, and other people do that. And these are no longer kind of making sense. They're not completely wrong, and that's a really tricky part, is they are still true. When you're on your mobile phone, you're often in a hurry, but then sometimes you're absolutely not in a hurry. And so what exactly does that mean? Whoops. So these were statements that people were making just a few years ago. People were saying things like, content is of very little value if it doesn't address your context. If you're building a mobile site, you have to look at the user's context, or your site will be meaningless. It has to be all about context. And Google was saying things like, there's 3 user types. Some of them are bored, some of them are urgent, some of them are repetitive. These are the user types for mobile, and then all the other are the desktop user types that we're used to. And so they were trying to boil it down to a couple different interactions, which, as we can see, is probably not true anymore. Yeah. And this was just, a year ago. Mobile users are on the go. They're interested in quick, glanceable stuff. They're distracted. And yes, that's true, except when they're absolutely not distracted and not on the go. And so this is still really confusing. So now we're starting to have conversations like these. This is a user who's saying, I love this website. They're talking about a mobile website for The Guardian in the UK. I love the site. It looks great. It's easy to navigate. They've done a great job here. Well done. But can you put more news in it? It's a news site right now that only contains a fraction of the news that you find on the desktop site. So it doesn't make sense anymore to do that, right? And this is somebody else talking about the very same site. They're saying, hold on, there should actually be a text-only version of the desktop site because I don't like the busyness of text-only version of the desktop site because I don't like the busyness of the main site. I mean, it's basically people are starting to actually want to use the mobile for other purposes because it's actually quieter, the content is easier to read and all that stuff. So it's kind of changing our expectations of what we should do on the desktop. This is another Jeremy Keith quote, which I thought was priceless. Mobile users want to see, the menu and hours and delivery numbers, all these quick little things, right? But apparently, desktop users definitely want to see a 1 megabyte ping of somebody smiling at a salad. I mean, as Luke was saying this morning, it doesn't make sense that we're actually designing fundamentally different content for both of these, and we actually have too much stuff on the one side and not enough on the other. And then the final one, also really like about context. A lot of people still thinking, okay, well, there's got to be this mobile context, and as long as I can suit this mobile context, my stuff will be fine. But, I'm moving, I'm in a car, I'm looking at your website, but it doesn't mean I'm in a hurry. It doesn't mean I'm trying to find an address or quickly look at a news site. Context cannot predict the way someone's going to use your website, and mind reading is no way to base fundamental content decisions. You just can't exclude people from stuff because you think they're going to be on a smaller device. So here's the problem space, and then after that I'm going to talk about what we can do maybe to change how we build the web or build websites. How do we create the next generation of content-rich, meaningful, usable, interesting websites? I mean, this is the problem, right? Is people aren't going to stand for stuff that's all of a sudden boring and really small and really uninteresting. That's just not going to work. Our customers won't stand for it. They still need their brand to be prominent and lovely and to show off their stuff. They still need all the content. Users want all the content, but the reality is there's going to be a lot more people using little things, right? And maybe they'll be bigger. Maybe it'll be an iPad. Maybe there'll even be something slightly bigger. But the thing is, it's not going to be this giant desktop thing that we had before. It's going to be portable, there's going to be interruptions, people will be on weird connectivity, there's going to be all this fragmentation, so what do we do? So part number 2, beyond the mobile web. And what I'm presenting here are just some ideas. So some ideas that so far have been well received, but at this point, we don't know how it's going to go. This one, however, I think is really important personally, which is idea number 1, loosen up. So basically, it kind of goes like this. Up until now, we've been thinking that we can control all sorts of stuff, right? So I think that's just going to have to stop. Unfortunately, control has kind of reached the point of being an illusion. There's too much diversity. This is a picture of the first 100 Android devices, and this is actually now about a year and a half old. There's already too much diversity just on the first 100 Android devices. And even though a lot of people have the iPhone, there's still going to be continuing diversity. And we can't all of a sudden say, oh, sorry, you guys aren't important because you just bought this phone that we don't want to support right now. It's just not going to make sense, right? Data's also moving around. There's stuff now being portable to all sorts of platforms, and it's going to keep going. People want it that way, and we want it that way. We've already set a lot of our content free. We just put it on RSS. We put it in all sorts of formats where people can take it and put it where they want and do things with it. So we're already kind of doing that. And then we don't know where it's going to end up. A lot of people don't really like Flipboard and the fact that it strips out all your branding and it just kind of leaves the content. But users love it, right? Because they can read stuff in peace and quiet. But this is the environment that we've created, and we're probably not going to actually go backwards. At this point, it doesn't make sense. And, so for all of our customers who are so excited about their brand, the problem is brand presence is also going away. You can see the Amazon logo here really clearly, but the thing that the person's reading, it's El Mundo newspaper. There is no El Mundo logo. There's a word, if you can see it. It's pretty small. But the brand has now just vanished, right? The content is what's important, but the brand presence is starting to recede. And brands aren't even kind of what they used to be. The conversations aren't occurring on brand websites anymore. The number of Disney fans on Facebook is kind of creepy as far as I'm concerned. But in marketing and advertising and branding, it's actually starting to kind of freak people out because they're starting to think, well, maybe we don't need a corporate site anymore, or maybe our corporate site shouldn't be what it was before, because some brands have most of their traffic on Facebook. It's crazy, but that's the way it is. And there's a lot of places where I'm seeing people just replace their URL with a Facebook URL. I saw this in Hong Kong recently a lot. Just no regular URLs, just Facebook, / whatever. Which all of a sudden starts to change. We kind of have a second internet almost on Facebook. So we've got all this stuff going on, and yet we somehow are still obsessed with controlling every single pixel of our website, which is kind of a weird thing considering all the other stuff that we've had to toss out and change and adapt to. And so often what that means is it happens at the expense of access. So here we are madly trying to create this perfect thing on 3 mobile phones, and meanwhile everyone else can't see your website at all. And that's what happens in a lot of cases. There's a lot of sites right now that are just completely broken on certain phones. You get to the homepage and maybe you see a bit of text and then you can't go any further. And so how is that actually better than, kind of letting go a little bit? In some ways, access is kind of a factor of user experience now. User experience isn't just about making it pretty or even making it work is actually the important thing, and some people just can't access it. And if they can't get to it, then is it that great? You can't plan for every contingency anymore. This is something I ran into just a few days ago. I mean, it's an exercise bike that seems to have Android on it, I think, but it's going to have a browser and it's going to have access to apps. And I mean, this is kind of a crazy thing, but this is what people will be using, right? They'll be using almost anything you can think of, and then all sorts of things you can't think of. So you'll never know how your site looks on every device. And so what we need to do is kind of start creating nimble, kind of looser experiences rather than perfect ones, because the perfect ones other people may never see. So that was my, whoops, this thing is just not working. So that was my idea number one. Idea number two is let them tweak, and them being users. Again, it's still kind of all about control. We talk about progressive enhancement a lot. It's really important. It's more important than ever. But right now, we're kind of doing it all ourselves. It's kind of like as developers, we have to build this progressively enhanced website, and that's really cool. But why not let users participate in some of these enhancements? And what it really is all about is the fact that, I mean, we don't really know what will be the most meaningful enhancements to some people, and trying to guess, well, if you try to guess, you end up with kind of what you have right now, where you say, I think the mobile user will want this, and in fact, actually, people might want slightly different stuff that you can't really detect or kind of plan with either an algorithm or a strategy or something. Now, just to be clear, I am not suggesting that all of a sudden we let users pick everything, because that would be completely insane. And we still have to deliver a really good baseline experience. And I think all websites should now have a user experience baseline that addresses all devices. You know, the stuff has to be somewhat responsive. Images have to be optimized for all sorts of different contexts in terms of how much bandwidth you'll have. You know, scripting has to be pragmatic. If you serve a script to a device that doesn't understand it, and as a result, the content's not accessible, that's no longer appropriate. Markup has to be semantic. So we still have to do all this stuff, right? But then we can potentially let users pick other things that are meaningful to them. So idea number one is letting them adjust data consumption. Again, right now, we're a lot of times we're focusing on the device. We're saying this is a netbook, therefore the person will have high bandwidth. Well, we don't really know that. In this particular case, she's using a little dongle. She's actually on 3G. I mean, she has as little bandwidth as I do on here, right? So, but we don't know. So let people choose the quality of the assets that they're delivered. And this is a website. It's a science website, so in their particular case, the images are really, really important. If you don't understand, or if you can't read the images, you might as well just not read part of the content. So what they've done is they've allowed various levels of resolution for it, and at the highest level, you actually get a pretty big image that actually makes it quite legible. And you could imagine in the future, if you were using something like SVG or Canvas for some of this, and actually you would have even more granularity available. I mean, right now it's still a flat bitmap image. And Google's been doing this for a long time as well. They have a high-quality little button thing on their videos because they know that because I'm on a phone doesn't mean I might actually have a lot of bandwidth, and this video might be really important to me, but they'll never know that. They can't guess that. So let me see a high-quality version if I want it, but if I don't, you get what is an appropriate default, and the appropriate default is probably if you're on a portable device to have less bandwidth, and probably the other way around on a desktop. So you still have to kind of try to understand what the most reasonable default would be. The next one is to tweak the reading experience, and I'm really surprised we haven't started doing this already. You know, we've got this idea now that because these browsers are great and you can tap and zoom and all this stuff, that we've solved, in some ways, we've kind of solved some of the problems, because if people want to see it, they'll just zoom, right? But that's really bad for continuity. I mean, I've tried reading articles where I'm having to constantly readjust the viewport to see the rest of the article, and it's a complete pain. This is just a prototype by Craig Maud recently of a way to let people choose their reading experience. And he's kind of organized it around, it was supposed to be for a tablet. So he had this idea that a tablet, you've got, you know, the bed view of the tablet where you're sitting in bed and it's maybe about this far, and then the tabletop view where it's about that far. And so he chose those as his parameters. But in some ways, they could be anything. But the idea is, you know, the layout is really flexible, the content is really malleable, and it's been made that way, so why not let people actually pick things other than just, you know, font size, which is something we sometimes do for accessibility reasons, but let people actually pick more of how they want their reading experience to be. And maybe we can even take it a step further. This is obviously a completely different example, but this is the MIT Media Lab logo, which recently has been created. And there isn't one logo, there's basically an algorithm with a bunch of design patterns, and you can create up to 40,000 different logos out of this logo, and it's made for employees to go and log in and design their own business card based on the one that they like. And in some ways, there's no reason we couldn't start thinking of content on the web like this. It's not the way we do it right now, but it probably almost needs to start to be this malleable. Maybe not 40,000, but certainly not the kind of the fixed version that we have at the moment, or maybe one or two versions if we're making it slightly responsive. And the thing to remember is that if we don't start doing some of this stuff, people will just keep going to places like Flipboard and basically stripping out everything we've done and just reading the content, because this is what it's turning into. And this is still a better reading experience in a lot of cases. Which then brings you to idea number 3, because the theme of all of this has been kind of content. So we talk about mobile first, but maybe we should be talking about content first. And so, designing mobile first, as Luke said, it helps you focus. It helps you really think, okay, what do people actually need? And what is the stuff, the superfluous kind of fluffy stuff that we've added because of our corporate structure or whatever it is we've decided to add it for? But, we need to find a happy medium. So we've got the busy desktop and the kind of peaceful mobile at the moment. Clearly, that's not really helping anyone right now. We need something in the middle that is inherently more suited to all sorts of contexts. But I think we actually need to go a step further than that. This was a nice classic quote by Alan Cooper, interaction design and UX person. I'm sure some of you people know. And no matter how cool your interface is, it would be nice if there were less of it. We are focusing still way, way too much on the interface, and probably just historically because we had such big screens, So on small screens, the content ends up front and center. You've got this big page with all this navigation and all this stuff, and some of it's useful, but some of it is just there, like Luke was saying, because there's extra space. But actually, when you look at it on mobile, you end up tapping or zooming, and all you want is the piece of content in the middle, right? So if we design for content first, we actually have a lot more that we can work with. We've got semantic structures now. We've got things that we can do to mark up content in much more intelligent ways than we were way at the beginning when we were adding font tags right in the markup and so on. We were already separating content from presentation to a certain extent, but we're just not adding enough information back in so that we can do something relevant with it. So what ends up happening is we have these gorgeous, rich interfaces. And the content, however, ends up being the stuff that's kind of left behind. And part of it is because we tend to enter content into boxes like this. We all use CMSs, and we type this big, long paragraph, and it ends up being kind of flown into this beautiful, richly designed template that we've created. And most sites at the moment are being built as giant data containers, which has worked for a period of time. It's arguable whether it's going to continue to work for too much longer. But what we do is we create all these little areas, data containers for different stuff, and then we say, template for this and template for that, and region of the site for this and for that. And this makes sense for people like this who have big, highly structured, really, somewhat consistent data. You could say that Twitter isn't consistent, but actually it's pretty consistent. There's so much metadata that's implied in how you enter a tweet, who you are, or the time. There's all this stuff that's already there, and it's already very structured compared to your average blog post, which basically has a date, and then this huge mass of stuff, right? So these guys already have pretty structured data. Whoops. And if your content is really user-generated, then you can orchestrate really structured data. Again, here, this whole thing is created so that you enter pretty structured content. And they've created it that way so that they have stuff to work with that's really malleable. So that's not too bad either. And again, if it's inherently structured, you're doing okay. But then, if you want to do stuff like this, and a lot of us still make our living designing stuff like this. The brands that pay us, they want stuff that represents their brand. They want rich content. And all of a sudden, a lot of the structure right now isn't really there. Another example of something like this, and this is actually a pretty simple one, but they used a giant bitmap for some of this. Some of this stuff we can start to do, and stuff like this. This is Flash at the moment, but it could actually go much further than that. So here we are back to the unstructured, formless content, and it's no wonder at this point that we can't do a whole lot with this stuff. What we're running into at the moment is because we have different contexts, it's actually making it really hard to kind of select it and filter it. I mean, what we'd like to do is say, okay, well, these images we're going to filter in this direction, and the content we're going to restructure so that it fits on this screen, and so on. But it's actually quite hard to do. So although the website itself ends up being responsive, this is your classic example of a quite nice responsive website, the content itself isn't that responsive at all. I mean, there's almost no variation to this. I'm sorry. It's like float left, float right, make it slightly bigger, make it slightly smaller. And yeah, I'm not really criticizing it, because this is still what we have to work with at the moment, because a lot of the content is completely unstructured. So what if we design content more like applications? What if there were inherent structure to them that we could actually manipulate? And I think this is an area that we need to start to move towards, simply because otherwise we're going to keep making really, really pretty containers. But the problem is our users right now, they don't want the containers, they want the content. So the container gets pushed out until you have nothing but content, and then we're back to the content, right? So I do think we need to start moving in this direction. Just a couple examples if you want to go check some of these out. This is actually HTML, although the New York Times mostly uses Flash, just because it's probably just so much faster to do and so much easier to support on lots of browsers. But this is a completely interactive HTML-based example. And other examples like this, again, this is just a random thing that I found, where he's made an entire there's actually quite a lot of content in this, because everything is interactive. I mean, you can click on the map, you can click on any of the stuff down here, and it's just so much more engaging than basically what would have been a giant blog post with just a couple pictures. And at the moment, unfortunately, these things aren't responsive. They can't go to multiple devices. And this is a good example of the very smallest thing you could do as content as application, right? This is actually on the Apple site. The examples at the bottom are just screenshots to show you what it does. But the piece at the top is actually the interactive piece. And they made this to show how the iPad case kind of folds over. And it's just one tiny little piece of really incredibly well-crafted interactive content. Doesn't use Flash, it's all HTML. But in some ways, when our canvas is potentially going to be this small, wouldn't you rather interact with something like that than still get the information through a lot of text, which is kind of still what we're doing right now. And then, of course, you can go what if, and you can imagine all sorts of other stuff. How am I doing? Oh, I'm pretty good. OK, so idea number 4 is the last one. So, we've kind of started to loosen things up in all sorts of ways. We've hopefully talked about adding more structure. But maybe we need to change the way we actually build websites altogether. Here I am tearing the entire web apart. So we've got these right now. We've got these big hulking sites. And I mean, I work with some large clients, as I'm sure most of you guys do too. And most websites, they're just this mass of legacy stuff, right? And every time you add new stuff, you bolt some other piece of a CMS onto it. And so the very concept of taking something like that and trying to make it work on 100 different devices or 200 different devices, I mean, it's enough to make you cry some days, because there's no path around it. And so, maybe I'm just rationalizing, but maybe what we need to do is actually start to make websites actually fundamentally different. I mean, why do we need this big hulking corporate presence? And again, if you go back to the ideas of, people interacting with Facebook, people interacting with Twitter, the corporate website is becoming increasingly meaningless anyways, for a lot of consumers anyways. I mean, I think the brands still love their corporate website, right? But most consumers just don't interact that way anymore. And so, we've already started decoupling. I mean, we have your average website, but now we've got, we use Facebook for all sorts of communications, all sorts of outward outreach and information and stuff to people, and we're pushing it out, right? And so we use Twitter for things like support and PR. Thank you. And then we've got blogs, and certainly those are, heavily used and really useful at this point, and we use those for thought leadership and evangelism. I mean, all of us work in industries where this is kind of the world, the sphere that we operate in, and it's working pretty good. I mean, we've got much richer interactions with brands now than we did 6 or 7 years ago through all of this stuff, right? And then, you add a little bit more to it, so you've got product marketing, so people are putting stuff on YouTube. I mean, a lot of brands are getting rid of their big, giant proprietary video collections on their website in their weird proprietary player that they designed in Flash. And they're just putting everything on YouTube because that's where people are. It's more social. People can share it. They get statistics. It's kind of good for everyone. And as we know, it's very good for Google, but it's actually still good for other people. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this. At least it seems to be working so far. And, and so it's starting to actually spread even further. LinkedIn with human resources lately just seems to be exploding, where a lot of companies are just doing their recruitment on LinkedIn. So the section of the site that used to be, your corporate recruitment thing is now kind of going away, and it's all being done this way. And yet there's still the brand message at the beginning. I mean, most of us who interact with brands like this, I don't think we're confused. I don't think we're like, I really don't know who I'm talking to right now. Most of the time, as long as the brands are genuine and they make it clear where everything is, people get it, people understand, and there's no worry about the brand being all of a sudden vastly diluted. So really, we should be thinking of it kind of as an ecosystem of touch points and utilities and conversations that we share with people through the internet, rather than potentially this giant hulking website. And that then starts to make it a lot easier to actually deal also with the diversity that's coming. And in particular, the word utilities, I think, is really important. And I'll touch on that towards the end. So we've got some examples of this already. And Google. I mean, Google is one brand, it's one company. We know who Google is, we're not confused. And yet, Google is actually a million different things. And we interact with all of these things in different ways, but they're intricately related. And then Google, however, has I can't find the word I'm looking for, the advantage of being able to actually do things that it needs to do in different ways. So, for example, Google Docs is available primarily for the desktop at the moment, because it is still a challenge to do all of that on smaller screens. But they've started to roll out some separate apps. And, there's been other things like Google Maps that from the very beginning they've decided it's actually kind of a core product, and they need to make sure it's available on all the platforms where people are. But they're not bound by the idea that all of Google has to do the same thing all the time, right? Some of the products can function in a kind of different way. And as long as they know their audience, and as long as they know where the audience lives and the best interaction, they focus on that. So some of it might be an app, some of it might be on the web, some of it might be somewhere else. And as we see now with Google, some of it is now going to be potentially in your home, kind of all spread out. But all of a sudden, there is no one Google website, really. There's a whole bunch of Googles. Amazon is starting to be very similar. They've got all these little products that they're starting to roll out. And then the Kindle is a great example, because you've got the physical product of the Kindle. They've added some smaller subsets of Kindle players on platforms where it makes sense. If the platform doesn't make sense, they leave it alone. But the bulk of Amazon is really still the web, right? So, whoops. This thing is going to die right at the end. So the web, their core, which is the middle here, which is the highly optimized bit, that's the one where they make sure that you can access Amazon.com from almost any device possible, and they've done that for a long time. But then they've got their little app platform, the Amazon apps. They chose Android at the moment because that made sense. It was open, they could do it. It's kind of experimental. Maybe they'll get rid of it. But it doesn't impact the fact that Amazon.com is available from all sorts of devices, and that's kind of their core audience. And I'm finding that more and more companies are starting to do this. And I'll leave with one final example, which is the BBC, which I think is the most relevant for the stuff that we're talking about. Because the BBC's been online for a very, very, very long time. But because their products are kind of broken out in different categories, they've been able to say, you know what, this audience we know is over here. We're not going to stress out about the fact that we can only support them in this area, and we're going to maybe make sure we support other people in a different area. So we've got BBC World Service, for example, which is the philanthropic arm. They help people learn English overseas in emerging economies. They do all sorts of kind of development work. And so their audiences clearly need to be interacted with using WAP, SMS. They do a lot of voice stuff to teach English in India. They use XHTML-MP still. And that's completely fine, because they know that that's that audience. It doesn't impact the fact that the big BBC website, which has a slightly different audience, it gets to deal with it slightly differently. Now, as it happens, the BBC website also has a massive audience, so they actually support thousands of devices. However, they recently discontinued WAP. They decided we were just not getting enough WAP traffic on BBC, the main news site, and so that one's been discontinued. But meanwhile, down here, they're still using WAP. And so it's not kind of a do all one thing or do all of another, whether it's all apps or mobile or whatever, is decide what's best for your audience and basically go where they are and use the platforms that are important to them. But it gives you a lot more freedom. You know, the BBC iPlayer delivers entertainment. They deliver videos of all the shows, they resell shows, they do all sorts of stuff. So for years now, they've been going towards the Wii and the PSP, and they weren't really worried that it wasn't properly on the internet yet, because most of their audience was actually interacting with it on this side here. And I think that's kind of the way we need to start to think about brands and about the web in general. Start to kind of distribute it in places where it makes sense. And so, I have got the term flagship app up there. I mean, there's a lot of people in marketing who are starting to think, okay, the mobile web is for the masses, we have to be there. But then the apps, they're calling them basically loyalty apps, or almost like the equivalent of a loyalty card. We'll make the apps, the actual rich native apps, maybe rich web apps, for the people that we know really well. We know why they're there. We know how to engage with them. We know what they're going to want and what we're going to give them. And for everyone else, we give them the mobile web. And it doesn't mean the mobile web has to be bad, but it just means you target your energies where you know they're going to make the most sense, rather than trying to decide, apps or web, and then kind of getting stuck. And leave you right at the end. Again, if you listen to people in marketing and advertising right now, they're actually thinking about the mobile web a lot, but they're thinking kind of on their terms, which is, there's some really interesting conversations going on. But in the future, brands will no longer be places you visit, but they'll be people you meet along the road. And that is it. URL to the presentation on SlideShare. How much time do we have for questions? Oh, okay, that's actually good, okay. Any questions? Is there a mic, or?
Right, hello. So you said that content should adapt to different devices, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the content should change, right? I mean, the main thing which personally irritates me when I visit mobile version, it's that I'm served different content from the desktop version. I don't want to be, maybe there's a context taken into account, right? I might be in a hurry, so I don't want to read a lot. But the reason being is I want to access the content the way I would access it on desktop. But I'm on the go, for example. And the other side of the problem is I'm actually working for a company who uses CMS to provide the sites for huge corporate clients. And the problem they have now at the moment, when this huge rise on the mobile, they're thinking, okay, should we go with this approach when we provide the content version for mobile, which is different from the desktop version, or should we just adapt it somehow? So you have one authoring system, CMS systems, you enter the data, you enter the mobile, you enter the content, which is no different from desktop or mobile. It doesn't matter. So
Yes. let me elaborate, though, but I tend to agree completely with what you're saying. I mean, I think the problem right now is we're doing kind of an and/or. So we're saying mobile people get this, desktop people get this, and maybe even worse, tablet people get this. So we're starting to really fragment it, but with no really good understanding of why we're doing it. And all these labels like tablet and smartphone, they're really just not helping, because it's still about your behavior and what you're looking for, and you just probably want the same content. And I think, unfortunately, what's going to have to happen is, first of all, the stuff that we're putting on the desktop has to be more streamlined and has to be more focused. And I think a lot of us are saying this. I mean, I remember I've been building websites for 10, 12 years now, and they actually used to be pretty small. They were pretty lightweight. We used to worry about how heavy they were. We used to think about all the content we put in. We used to worry about things being above the fold and below the fold. And now, no one talks about that anymore, right? You just kind of load content into the website until it just kind of heaves with stuff. And I mean, I know how we got there, but I think we actually need to go back the other way to where we have only the content that people need. And once you do that, it does get a lot easier to start going to all these versions. And you don't have to decide what content to take away, because you probably have just enough content. It's kind of that just enough for what people want, rather than kind of adding more. So I mean, I would definitely say not to try to pick and choose what content goes where, because you'll never get it right. Trim things down, focus it, make sure your copy is really tight, that it really means what it should mean. Use more images if you can, but really meaningful ones, and editorialize more and make sure that the stuff you're delivering is exactly what's needed. And a lot of time, that helps a lot of it. That gets rid of that first hurdle of, oh, wow, we have so much stuff, how are we going to make it small? I'm not saying it's going to solve every problem, but I think we're making our websites now just based on the fact that we've got all this room and we just keep piling stuff in. And I don't think audiences appreciate it either. And as we're seeing with things like Flipboard and stuff, there's too much noise. I mean, reading now on the web is crazy. And you've got a banner ad doing this over here and other stuff over there. I don't know how it got this bad, really, other than, I would say, just because we could, really. Hopefully that answers. Anyone else? Sorry, it's too close to lunch.
What do you think of iPad magazines where the opposite happens? Publishers going to digital, but keeping it exactly how they want to.
I mean, I think if it works for their audience, I don't like making, I don't like saying absolutely do this and never do that, because I think each audience is different. You know, I read The Economist on the iPad, for example, and actually the content they serve there, there's absolutely no reason they couldn't do it on the web. I mean, it's just this big block of text. They've stripped out most of the images, they've stripped out all the ads, which actually should have been an opportunity for them, but they're not serving the ads. So sometimes I just don't know why they're doing it that way. And now I know there's things like Wired where they actually, you know, they try to do all the animation and all this stuff. I think it still goes back to knowing your audience. I mean, whether it's serving people stuff online or selling people stuff, if you sell stuff just kind of randomly and you don't know why you're doing it, I'm not trying to say that brands don't know why they're doing stuff, but it seems we push a lot of products out, and just simply because there's an audience, right, and you think, oh, somebody will want it. And the companies that really target, I mean, okay, let's talk about Apple, right? We know Apple really targets, and they really get at the heart of what people love. They do really, really well, and there's examples in all sorts of, you know, other demographics of products, whether it's clothing brands or cars or whatever, where their audience is so tight, they know exactly what the audience wants, the audience understands what the brand's going to deliver, and so people will pay more for premium products, or people will go out of their way to get something. And I think that's the attitude we need to have with digital stuff as well. If there's a really good justification, if you can make something so much better, and you think it's justified enough to not deliver it to more people, and instead make it perfect on a certain platform, I think it's still, you know, it's up to you to decide. But as we're seeing, a lot of the stuff right now, it's not working either way. People are making these really super expensive things for the iPad, and, you know, they're getting 20,000 subscribers after a year. And so clearly that decision isn't working. And it's getting back to finding out what the audience wants, I think. I mean, I know that sounds really kind of easy and lame, saying, you know, find out what your audience wants, but I think we're just being overwhelmed by all the features and technology and saying, oh, this is so cool, let's go make more stuff. Oh, there's one more in the corner there. Oh.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. That was fantastic. I know I'm potentially inviting another hour, which I think we'd all like for this question.
I can't hear you very well.
Sorry. Yeah. Talked about content first.
Yeah.
Talked about a focus on the system and distributed experiences. I know potentially a long answer, but how do you start to consider designing for experiences that are multi-location, multi-device, that need to interact seamlessly? What are your thoughts?
I mean, personally, and I probably have a bit of a bias because I've been working in more on the content side for a long, long amount of time, but a lot of the projects that I've seen where things go wrong and where you don't understand how to design for all these different eventualities is when you don't think about the content. I mean, most content projects I'm seeing still, people are saying, okay, we need X, someone goes and designs the interface with no idea of what content's going to go inside. And it's not necessarily their fault a lot of times, it's actually just organizationally. A lot of clients just don't think about the content until the very, very end. They're like, oh yeah, we've got someone over here working on the content, don't worry, you'll get it at the end. And so we still end up building something really pretty on the outside. And then you put the stuff in, and I think it still needs to work the other way around. It needs to come from the content out. And because if you know the content well, and you can design the content, you can then design the experiences around it, I think, because otherwise you're still dealing with this mass, basically, of just stuff that you're putting in. And we'll be back to basically designing interfaces that are wonderfully adaptive, but content that just kind of came in at the end. And admittedly, I know this is also really hard because we have a lot of user-generated stuff, we have a lot of real kind of just-in-time content where you really don't know what's going to go there. So it's probably just the worst answer ever, really. Anything else? Nope.
It's the last question. Still one question related to the previous one. For instance, if you have, I don't know, like a series of articles, a huge amount of content, how exactly do you start designing from the content out? Like, what would be the first step? What would be the first steps?
Yeah. I would say, first of all, I mean, again, this is going to sound, but this is probably what our next talk should be about. Actually, and Brian's going to talk about this a little bit, but I think I should probably make another talk about this for next year. Content analysis, I think, is a good way to start. I mean, because still, I still think, for example, we use the word content, right? And in every organization I've ever worked with, there are people who know the content really well. They know why it's been written, they know who it's for, they know what aspects of the content are useful to their audience and which ones aren't. And those people rarely get involved in projects that I've worked on anyways. It often comes kind of towards the end. We're all worried about the interface, we're worried about the interaction, worried about navigation. And half of navigation is just to help find stuff that people can't find because the content isn't clear enough, because the language isn't clear enough, because there's too much of it, so people get to this big page and they don't want to read the whole thing, and so they miss half the meaning. Like, I still think a lot of it can be boiled down to content, because when it's really, really clear, a lot of the navigation happens by itself between hyperlinking and real clarity of narrative in the content. So I think it still starts with going back to the stuff you have and starting to trim it down, because most of the time you can trim it down, which then goes back to knowing the audience and what they're actually going to want. And I know this probably still sounds like a really bad answer, but yeah, that's about all I can say at this point.
Okay, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation.